Welcome back. We are jumping into something that I needed to jump into earlier, November 19th. I picked up this book and really meant to start talking about it earlier, but here we are. It's dense, as you can tell. Who Wrestle with God by Jordan Peterson. This is one that I had originally intended to do in one go, not read it in one go. It's a bit over 500 pages. Yeah, 520 or so, including the citations. So it's relatively dense for someone who you could argue is a little bit mainstream, definitely still renowned in a academic sense, but also in the self-help category. So typically those things are more approachable. This is definitely not a super approachable book. But the adjusted approach now is going to be a video per chapter. I think that is the more appropriate way for me to address this, keep my mind clear, my thoughts clear, and talk about this. And when it's all done, I will try to put them into one long video. I won't make a new one. I'll just link them all together for the whole book summary. So this is you can call it a summary, review, analysis, whatever you want, but it's a little bit more in depth on the introduction and some of the opening things to understand about the book. So if you've followed him at all, um, you'll know that this guy is very dense with his topic. So this is his fourth mainstream book. When I look online, it shows that he has some poetry books or one book of like poems or short fiction. I actually struggle to know if it's real or not. So I think it is, but I'm going to focus more on his nonfiction. So this is his fourth nonfiction book. The first being Maps of Meaning from 1999, I believe, and then his really mainstream hits 12 Rules for Life and Beyond Order 12 More Rules for Life. So, where he breaks down 24, as you can guess, rules for life, which is actually from a Quora post that he did, breaking down, I think, 42 things that he recommended people live by, and it just blew up on the question answer site Quora. And this is his fourth nonfiction book, his third since, I don't know if you'd call it breaking mainstream, but since gaining some popularity beyond just the academic sphere. And it is by far, well, his first book has its own type of density, but this, of the three more mainstream ones, this one is the least approachable so far. I'm two chapters in, and definitely very, 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 very dense in its material. I found myself rereading a lot of sections of this book and taking a handful of notes, which I have in front of me. So just know that heading into it. The book is broken down into 11 sections. An introduction of sorts. He doesn't really call it that. It's a foreshadowing page or section rather. 9 main chapters and then a concluding chapter. Um, and by everything I can tell in the book, it is one of multiple planned volumes. The book really just hits early Genesis, which I was wondering how deep he'd go, but it ends with a second part discussion. He has 2 chapters on Moses, and then it jumps ahead to Jonah. So that's a pretty big jump if you're familiar with biblical um, book structure. He stays in the book of Genesis for all this, which, if you haven't watched his biblical series on Genesis on YouTube, I think it's a fantastic mix of the psychological and religious. And this was done years ago, maybe 6, 7 years at this point. And it's very good series. Takes about 30 hours to watch. But this book, my assumption was that it would cover a lot of that, but he definitely takes a different perspective this time around. The author spares no time jumping into pretty heady topics, and one that I found actually quite interesting was 2 descriptions he utilizes. One is breaking down the understanding of the word psychology and the Greek psyche, and he goes on a little bit of how this is could be understood as transfiguration, metamorphosis, and elaborates further on it, essentially translating to butterfly. And that, don't quote me on that fully. He breaks it down a little bit more in understanding kind of certain, really the word transfiguration and how that has evolved. And when you understand a butterfly and the caterpillar to butterfly transformation is pretty intense and pretty remarkable and pretty beautiful, all things considered. And so he addresses that and talks about Paul's description in, I believe, 1 Corinthians 11 through 13. Yeah, of being a child and behaving as a child and then becoming a man, a grown up, and putting away childish things. This transfiguration, this transmutation from young to old, um, and in a biblical context, from, I wouldn't say less divine necessarily, but stepping into the fullness of your divine path. He also jumps in from there to a deeper understanding of Elijah the prophet, and specifically, and I'll read this, you'll find me doing this probably a handful of times in this series, is reading directly from it. He states, "Why is all this relevant to our account of the prophet Elijah and to the understanding of life? Because his manner of death and his later appearance in the company of the transfigured Christ are both representative or symbolic of the psyche's capacity for qualitative and revolutionary transmutation." So he's describing here that the transitions that happen with characters in the biblical text, especially understanding Christ at a deeper level later on in the New Testament, New Covenant texts, is symbolic of our own psyche and our own mind's ability to do this. So, one of the things that you will notice, definitely in the introduction, and I think as you continue through his reading in general of this, at least as far as I've gotten, is it's very much reading like a journal where he's going in depth with a lot of the things he knows. He's a very smart person and very well researched person, but it often feels like a deeper glimpse into his mind because it doesn't feel fully formulated. It feels more like this is his understanding of everything he knows psychologically and all of his clinical psychology work coming into play with him trying to understand the more lived experience of the religious because he's relatively well studied. I shouldn't say relative, he's very well studied in religious history and different religions of the world and trying to bring in his understanding of biblical faith on a personal level. You're getting a lot of that here in these texts. Another note he made that I found pretty interesting, if you're familiar at all with the transfiguration on Mount Sinai from Matthew, I believe 17, 1 through 6. You can find all these references in his book or look them up as well. This like shining image of Christ that you see. And Peterson in this instance talks about this divine coming down and the calling of humans up towards it in this meeting in the middle, that there is, as he would describe, I'll read this again verbatim, this shining is the co-occurrence of the ultimate up, so to speak, with what is normally merely human, an indication of the descent of the divine to the profane, or the ascent of the profane or worldly upward. It therefore makes sense, symbolically speaking, that such revolutions in character or transmutations of psyche occur on mountaintops. The summit of the holy mountain is the mythical place where heaven and earth touch, where the merely material meets the transcendent and divine. Which I think, from a very practical sense, people get that same feeling when you're in high places. There's something almost magical about it. And of course, you don't have to be deeply religious to have that feeling. And I think looking at these metaphors and the mythology here, I think is just a really interesting approach that he's taking. He also goes on to say in the same paragraph, which, mind you, some of these paragraphs are long. They're not quite the ancient run-on paragraphs that you see in certain books, and it's definitely no David Foster Wallace record-breaking length, but some of them are a half page to longer. So he goes on later in this paragraph to continue on this mountaintop and transfiguration topic by describing the journey towards fulfillment of self is that it's climbing a mountain, seeing the peak, rejoicing in that, and then identifying the next mountain. And from his perspective, a psychologically religious point of view, that can be jumping from peak to peak, where as you hit this new peak, this new divine, then that higher power calls you to the next peak, to the next summit. So there's never an end to that until you hit that divine point, which is technically not fully possible, but you can step closer and closer to that. And each step up does require summiting a new mountain and a new peak, which I think is actually a very beautiful metaphor. The main thing that I wrote to myself that felt like a pattern in here, these are my personal notes, is that you see these mountains appear multiple times in scripture and in his descriptions here. The transfiguration of Christ, Moses receiving the 10 words, Jacob's ladder, that these peaks are where the divine and profane, God and man, will meet, and that we ascend in our maturation only to be beckoned again by God to summit the next mountaintop, to climb the next rung on the ladder, which to me is a balance of joyful pursuit while also maintaining a pace that you do not get discontent with the fact that you're always climbing. And I think that's a tough balance for me and for a lot of people. He then starts to bring in some of the things he's more earlier known for, which is dissecting a lot of classic mythology and fairy tale, one here being the Lion King. He also goes in a little bit into the Brothers Grimm fairy tale, The Water of Life, but talking about kingdom actually being a king and being put on a throne, and the importance of a rightful king being on the throne. Why is this important? Well, in his words, to read from the paragraph, when the wrong principle is established as supreme, when a false king is set upon the throne of an impious ethos. Sorry, when a false king is set upon the throne, or an impious ethos prevails, the people quickly find themselves deprived of the very water of life. More deeply, however, a kingdom oriented around the wrong pole, that worships the wrong god, so to speak, suffers psychologically or spiritually. I think this is spot on. And you'll see a lot as we go forward. There's this idea of cultural broadness, this king or father figure. Most things have that. Most households have kind of a primary figure, not always. Most, I shouldn't say most. There's almost always this primary figure in any type of situation. Companies have that. Cities, countries. There's this top seated thing, and when that is stewarded properly, we have people thriving. And he'll go on later to argue that that's stewarded properly when we encourage the individual's pursuit and that leader also pursuing truth in themselves and for their people. So he talks more about um, the story of Elijah and him finding the widow at the well. And he makes a really interesting point here because that widow offers him water despite being in a state of need. Herself, she offers something back. And he makes a point here that I love: the necessity of moral orientation, even under conditions of privation. Now, this is one of multiple points he's making. That's why it cuts off awkwardly, but it's this deeper question of, are you actually morally sound and good? Or when put in a position where you're deprived of something, will you keep your morals? Or are you only a morally good person because it's convenient? Are you only giving away your wealth because you're rich? Would you do it if you had little? Because I know people who don't give away a lot, and I also know people who don't have much and they would give everything. So a lot of your morality is tested when you are experiencing privation and when you're experiencing want and need. Just a big thing, I think, to reflect on. And even here, I made this point for myself that living waters are found in righteous actions. Moral orientation is an obligation regardless of circumstance. I think that's phenomenal. If there's ever an instance where that moral responsibility is just shrugged off, then you're not really in alignment with that moral stance. The title of this foreshadowing introduction, he calls it foreshadowing. The title is The Still Small Voice, and right here on page, it's the Roman numeral pages XXIV. So on page 24 of that style of paging, numbering, he talks about the still small voice and refers to it specifically as the voice of conscience, the voice of the conscience itself, the internal guide to what is right and wrong, which pretty much all of us have when we make a decision. We feel like, okay, this is the decision that I'm making, and I feel a certain way about it. He then moves on to elaborate on this slightly, saying that this is a discovery of unparalleled magnitude, the possibility of establishing a relationship with God by attending to conscience. God grants man and woman free will, even though he wants the allegiance of his created creatures and also wishes to guide them. How can he best manage to reconcile these competing desires? Not by command, force, or fear, but by the provision of a voice, an image, or even a feeling that can nudge and suggest or shame and humiliate, quietly and softly, even though it is capable of magnifying its intensity when necessary. So, an argument there that conscious feeling that we have, that conscience, rather, if you're going to take a religious stance, is from God. That free will that we are given, mixed with this voice of direction if we are willing to listen. That's why so many people will tell you from a religious perspective, there's a combination of knowing and trusting, and there's a relational component too. You can't just read a Bible and get the religious experience from it. That misses the point. And you can't just be someone who says, I'm religious and spiritual and not be in the Bible. There's this mix of cognitive and emotional, this knowing, knowledge, and relationship, which a lot of people I think understand, but just hearing this perspective is fun to hear it come from his words. So he continues to go on from there in a section here that I really love that I starred. He states, "We perceive, therefore, in accordance with our aim. That is a remarkable and insufficiently heralded realization, implying as it does nothing less than that both our misery and our joy depend on our values." Which, that's pretty intense, I would say. We perceive, therefore, in accordance with our aim. Both our misery and our joy depend on our values. So, whatever you value and whatever you believe, you're just going to be seeing that. It's the whole example that you might have heard of. If you were to be asked, how many red cars have you seen today? You might not have any idea. But if I told you over the next day, I want you to pay attention to how many red cars you've seen, you're going to know pretty spot on. And it's because you're looking for it. So, a lot of the times when we are experiencing suffering, that can be attributed to the fact that we are looking for suffering. Not all the time. Just like in the other case, you're going to remember certain red cars just by happenstance. But when you choose to focus on suffering, you'll find it more. And when you choose to focus on joy, you'll find it more. So I think that's pretty straightforward. One note that I forgot to mention a second ago on the moral privation piece, I believe, just a note that I had made, I found interesting, was that there's actually a note that he said, "There can be no wealth in the absence of true moral order. Under the guidance of the appropriate animating spirit, privation can be made a distant memory." So to me, I read that as moral order creates wealth and eliminates privation. So if at this point you're feeling like I'm all over the place here, to some extent I am. And also to some extent so is the writing. He's making not really a case, but an exploration. He's making a journey for you to travel on with him. That's why I was saying that this reads a lot like a journal. I struggled at many points to find point to the whole section, and more and more I found myself just reading each chunk as its own thing. Where he's talking about the still small voice. He's talking about the importance of, and if I had to put a key guiding factor here, it's the importance of aligning yourself with a higher purpose, is kind of the deeper meaning and understanding that I myself am pulling from these readings. So just bear that in mind. And so as I continue with discussing aim, he states again here that our aim delineates around us a moral landscape, with the destination we are striving toward serving as the highest imaginable good, at least for the time and place given relevance by our intent. Aim thereby gives the world its point, prioritizing and organize even our perception of it. Consequently, we see laid before us the pathway forward, the route we perceive as most likely to lead us to where we have determined to go. We see what and who impedes our movement forward, and we despair. We see what and who aids us, and we hope. So, as we've discussed, when you have your aim aligned with where you want to go, you will see your obstacles and your support in relation to the aim. If I want to be the greatest ping pong player in the world, and that's the only thing I care about, then pretty much everything I look at will be through a lens of what is helping me be the best table tennis player to ever live. So if you have a higher power goal, then that means you're aware of what things steal and aid to that goal. So, and I believe the last main note I took from this section from him is verbatim: we see character too as aim. Character is aim embodied. The habitual pursuit of aim, that is the point of someone's action. So someone's character and their action ultimately shows their aim in life, which is a very scary and humbling thing. Now, that doesn't mean anytime you slip up, you make it clear that you're aiming for awful stuff. No, it just means that you're slipping up in that moment. Your aim got off. You missed the mark, or you sinned, so to speak, in that. I think it's the Greek relation of the words. And lastly, I'll just read my last few thoughts that I wrote down about this chapter from my perspective. One is that God's still small voice is our conscience, that part of us that receives inclination, the part that gets better and wiser as we attune to it, and hardens our hearts when ignored. I added that last part as more of a curiosity that I'm pondering myself to see if it gets elaborated on more or if I just figure some stuff out myself. And then the last two notes are from me that our aim and our values determine how we perceive the world around us. Our aim is our morality. Obstacles and aids enlist despair and hope in relation to how they influence movement towards our aim. Character is the embodied action of aim. So that's the introduction. Chapter one, I think, is a little bit more succinct, but hopefully that gives you an opening understanding of the loose structure of where we're going.